Silas Thornfield pushed his daughter toward the Comanche warrior with the same indifference he'd show loading cattle into a pen. The cruel father handed her over because she was fat, worthless in his eyes, nothing more than a burden he could finally shed. Maggie clutched her small leather satchel against her chest. Her father's words cut deeper than any blade. Too heavy to marry off. Eats more than she's worth. The September sun beat down on the dusty ranch yard, but she felt cold as winter stone. Gianna Crow Feather stood motionless beside his painted horse. His dark eyes held no warmth, no welcome, just the flat acceptance of a man taking delivery of unwanted goods. The warrior's jaw tightened as he watched the white man's cruelty unfold. Silas wiped his hands on his worn pants as if washing away 16 years of fatherhood. He turned his back before Maggie could speak. No goodbye, no blessing, nothing. The other Comanche warriors waited in silence. Their horses stamped impatiently in the red dirt. Maggie's legs trembled beneath her plain brown dress. Everything she'd ever known sat behind her in that weathered ranch house. Everything uncertain stretched ahead. Gianna mounted his horse in one fluid motion. He gestured for her to climb up behind him. His movements carried no gentleness, only efficiency. Maggie's hands shook as she grasped his offered arm and pulled herself onto the animal's broad back. The horse lurched forward. Maggie grabbed Gianna's leather vest to keep from falling. The ranch house grew smaller with each hoofbeat. Her father never looked back. Wind whipped across the open prairie. Maggie's tears dried before they could fall. The rhythmic pounding of hooves matched the hammering of her heart. She pressed her face against Ayana's back and breathed in the scent of sage and leather. The warrior band rode in formation. Takoda, Ayana's younger brother, kept casting suspicious glances at the white woman. His face held the same hardness she'd seen in her father's eyes. Unwanted, unwelcome. They stopped at a creek to water the horses. Maggie slid down awkwardly, her legs stiff from the long ride. The other warriors spoke in their native tongue. Their voices carried undertones of disagreement. Gianna knelt beside the stream. He cupped water in his hands and drank deeply. Maggie approached cautiously, her throat parched from dust and fear. The water ran cold and clear over smooth stones. She knelt upstream from the warrior and splashed her face. The coolness brought momentary relief from the heat pressing down on the endless grassland. Takoda's voice rose sharply. He gestured toward Maggie with obvious displeasure. Gianna answered in measured tones, but tension crackling between the brothers like lightning before a storm. They mounted again. The afternoon sun climbed higher. Sweat dampened Maggie's dress. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but she dared not ask for food or rest. She was cargo now. Cargo didn't make demands. The landscape shifted from open prairie to rolling hills dotted with scrub oak. Red rocks jutted from the earth like broken bones. Hawks circled overhead, their cries sharp and lonely in the vast sky. As evening approached, they made camp in a shallow canyon. The warriors moved with practiced efficiency, tending horses and gathering firewood. Maggie sat on a flat boulder, uncertain where she fit in this alien world. Gianna approached with a piece of dried meat and a skin of water. He held them out without speaking. His eyes revealed nothing of his thoughts. The meat was tough and salty. Maggie chewed slowly, grateful for anything to ease the gnawing in her belly. Around the small fire, the warriors talked quietly among themselves. She understood none of their words but felt the weight of their stares. Night settled over the canyon like a dark blanket. Stars emerged in the clear sky, more brilliant than she'd ever seen. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks dancing upward. Gianna handed her a rough woolen blanket. He pointed to a spot near the fire where she could sleep. The gesture held no kindness, only practical necessity. Maggie wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. The wool smelled of smoke and horses. She lay down on the hard ground, using her satchel as a pillow. Sleep came fitfully. Strange sounds echoed through the canyon. Coyotes howled in the distance. The fire died to glowing embers, leaving only starlight to hold back the darkness. She woke before dawn to find Takoda shaking his brother's shoulder. Their urgent whispers carried alarm. Iana rose quickly, his hand moving instinctively to his knife. Something was wrong. The horses stirred restlessly, ears pricked forward. A sound carried on the morning wind. Voices, white voices. Maggie's heart leaped with desperate hope. Someone had come for her. Someone cared enough to follow. But Ayana's face showed only grim determination as he began breaking camp with swift, silent efficiency. No rescue was coming. This was her life now. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was truly alone. The voices faded with the morning mist. No rescue came. Only the endless journey deeper into Comanche territory, where red earth stretched toward a sky that promised nothing. The village appeared at midday. Hide lodges dotted the valley floor like pale mushrooms after rain. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children's laughter carried on the wind, a sound that made Maggie's chest tighten with longing. Women emerged from their lodges as the warriors approached. Their dark eyes assessed the white woman with cold calculation. Maggie felt their judgment pressing against her skin harder than the autumn sun. Winona stepped forward from the group. The chief's mother carried herself with quiet authority. Her weathered hands spoke of decades spent working hide and tending fires. She studied Maggie with eyes that missed nothing. Gianna dismounted and spoke briefly with the elder. His words were clipped, efficient. A transaction being concluded. Winona nodded once and gestured for Maggie to follow. The lodge smelled of sage and wood smoke. Buffalo robes covered the ground. Cooking vessels hung from wooden frames. Everything had its place in this ordered world where Maggie understood nothing. Winona handed her a wooden bowl and pointed toward a pot simmering over the central fire. The stew was unfamiliar but warm. The old woman watched her eat with the patience of stone. Days blurred into one another. Winona taught through demonstration rather than words. How to scrape hides, how to gather roots, how to move through the camp without drawing unwanted attention. Each lesson carried the weight of survival. Maggie's soft hands cracked and bled from the work. Her back ached from bending over hides stretched tight on frames. The other women watched her struggles with expressions ranging from pity to contempt. Kaya was the worst. Yana's childhood friend made her displeasure known through small cruelties, knocking over Maggie's water pot, pointing out her mistakes to the other women, whispering words that needed no translation. The white woman didn't belong here. Everyone knew it. Everyone felt it. Xiana avoided her completely. He worked with the horses at the far end of the camp. Sometimes she caught glimpses of him training the young animals, his movements fluid and sure. He never looked her way. October brought the first hard frost. Ice glazed the water vessels each morning. The horses grew thick winter coats. Maggie's breath clouded in the cold air as she worked beside Winona, learning to preserve meat for the lean months ahead. Then the sickness came. It started with the horses. 3 of the best animals fell ill with a wasting disease that left them weak and stumbling. The tribe depended on their horses for hunting, for travel, for life itself. The medicine man tried his remedies, sacred rituals, herbal treatments. Nothing worked. The horses continued to weaken. Maggie watched from a distance as Ayana knelt beside his favorite mare. The animal's ribs showed sharp beneath her dull coat. Her eyes had lost their fire. She was dying. That night, Maggie crept to the horse corral. The sick animals stood with hanging heads, their breath misting in the cold air. She'd seen this condition before on her father's ranch. She gathered willow bark and wild mint from the creek bed, mixed them with warm water in a wooden bowl. The horses resisted at first, but something in her voice calmed them. They drank the bitter mixture reluctantly. For 3 days she returned in secret, dosing the animals, watching for signs of improvement. On the 4th morning, Yana's mare lifted her head and nickered softly. By the end of the week, all 3 horses were eating again. Their coats began to shine. Strength returned to their legs. The tribe rejoiced, but no one knew what had caused the recovery. Yana found her by the creek that evening. He stood silently beside her as she gathered more willow bark. His presence made her hands tremble. He knelt and helped her gather the bark. His fingers brushed hers as they worked. No words passed between them, but something shifted in the silence. Winter settled over the valley with brutal efficiency. Snow buried the grasslands. Wind howled through the lodges. The tribe pulled inward, conserving heat and food for the harsh months ahead. Maggie's knowledge proved valuable in ways she'd never expected. Her mother had taught her to stretch provisions during lean times, to make soap from ashes and animal fat, to treat frostbite and winter coughs. The children began following her around the camp. They giggled at her broken attempts at their language but helped her learn new words. Their acceptance came easier than their mother's, untainted by suspicion or jealousy. Even Kaya's hostility began to thaw when Maggie helped deliver her sister's difficult baby during a blizzard. The white woman's steady hands and calm voice guided the infant safely into the world. One evening in late December, Gianna appeared at Winona's lodge. He spoke quietly with the elder, then turned to Maggie. His eyes held something different now. Not warmth, but not the old coldness either. They walked to the edge of camp where the horses stood huddled against the wind. Snow crunched beneath their feet. The night sky blazed with stars that seemed close enough to touch. He began to speak. His voice carried the weight of long-held burdens. The words came slowly at first, then faster, spilling out in the darkness between them. He told her about the day her father offered the trade, how it had sickened him to see a man abandon his child, how he'd accepted not because he wanted her, but because leaving her would have violated everything he believed about protecting the innocent. The truth hung in the frozen air between them. All these months she'd believed herself unwanted, a burden forced upon reluctant shoulders, but he'd taken her out of mercy, not disgust. Something cracked open in her chest. Not healing, not yet, but the beginning of possibility. They stood in silence as snow began to fall. Large flakes drifted down from the dark sky. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant fires. For the first time since her father's betrayal, Maggie felt the stirring of hope. Fragile and uncertain, but real. She wasn't worthless. She wasn't nothing. She was a woman who could heal horses and deliver babies, who could make children laugh and help strangers survive harsh winters, who could stand in the snow beside a man who'd chosen kindness over duty and feel something besides shame. The realization settled over her gently. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was exactly where she belonged. Spring came like a whispered promise. Ice cracked along the creek beds. Green shoots pushed through the melting snow. The earth itself seemed to exhale after winter's long holding of breath. The riders appeared on the ridge at dawn. Chief Broken Arrow's warband sat motionless against the brightening sky. 15 warriors painted for conflict. Their horses stamped and snorted, eager for violence. The village stirred uneasily. Women gathered children into lodges. Men reached for weapons with practiced calm. Maggie pressed herself against Winona's lodge, watching the drama unfold. Broken Arrow descended with his lieutenant, a scarred warrior whose hate filled the air around him. They rode straight to the center of camp where Chief Standing Bear waited. The confrontation came swift and brutal in its simplicity. Broken Arrow's voice carried across the silent village. The white woman brought death to their people. Her presence offended the spirits. She must be returned to her father or killed. Standing Bear listened without expression. His weathered face revealed nothing of his thoughts. When Broken Arrow finished speaking, the chief turned toward Winona's lodge. Maggie stepped forward before anyone could speak for her. Her legs trembled but held. The eyes of both warbands fixed upon her with the intensity of hunting hawks. She offered to leave voluntarily, to walk away from the only home she'd known since her father's betrayal. Her voice carried steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. Winona rose from beside her cooking fire. The old woman's words rang across the camp with quiet authority. She spoke of the white woman's value. The horses saved. The children taught. The winter survived. Other voices joined hers. The young mother whose baby Maggie had delivered. The elder whose frost-bitten fingers she'd treated. Even Kaya stepped forward, her former hostility replaced by grudging respect. Broken Arrow's face darkened with rage. His scarred lieutenant's hand moved toward his tomahawk. The moment balanced on a knife's edge between peace and bloodshed. Standing Bear raised his hand. The chief's decision would be final. No appeal, no second chances. He chose to keep the white woman. Broken Arrow spat in the dust and wheeled his horse. His parting words carried the weight of prophecy. Trouble would come from harboring their enemies. The spirits would demand payment. The warband vanished over the ridge like smoke. Their dust settled slowly in the morning air. The village breathed again, but uneasily. Everyone knew this wasn't finished. That evening, Iana found Maggie by the creek. She sat on the bank where they'd shared that first honest conversation in the snow. Spring water gurgled over stones worn smooth by countless seasons. He settled beside her without invitation. His presence filled the space between them with unspoken questions. The silence stretched taut as bowstring. She thanked him for standing with his chief, for not casting her out when it would have been easier. Her words felt small against the magnitude of what his people had risked. He turned toward her then. His dark eyes held depths she'd never seen before. Not pity or duty or resigned acceptance. Something that made her breath catch. He spoke of his wife who died 2 winters past. How grief had frozen his heart solid as river ice. How he'd thought feeling anything again would dishonor her memory. But Maggie had changed something. Not by trying or pushing or demanding. Simply by being present. By healing horses and teaching children and standing quietly beside him in the snow. His wife would have wanted him to find peace. To let his heart thaw like spring earth. To choose life over the cold comfort of eternal mourning. The words hung between them fragile as spider silk. Maggie felt tears she'd held back for months finally spill over. Not tears of sorrow, but of recognition. She understood the weight of unworthiness. The fear of reaching for something beautiful only to watch it break. They sat together as darkness gathered, neither speaking nor touching. Simply sharing the space where 2 damaged hearts acknowledged their scars and dared to imagine healing. The next morning brought a different kind of change. Yana appeared at the horse corral with a young stallion, wild and magnificent. The animal's eyes rolled white with fear and fury. He asked if she wanted to learn to train horses. Not just ride them or tend them, but truly understand their spirits. To speak their language of movement and breath and trust. The work was dangerous. The stallion lashed out with hooves and teeth, but Maggie felt something kindle in her chest she'd thought dead forever. Purpose. The knowledge that her hands could create rather than just endure. Days passed in careful choreography. Approach and retreat. Offer and acceptance. The stallion's wildness never fully disappeared, but it transformed into something else. Power held in partnership rather than conquest. Iana watched her progress with growing intensity. Not the desperate hunger she'd seen in other men's eyes, but something deeper. Recognition of kinship. 2 spirits learning to trust after betrayal. They worked side by side through the warming days of early summer. Their hands brushed as they handled ropes and leather. Their voices mingled in soft words meant to calm frightened animals. The attraction grew like prairie grass after rain. Slow and steady and undeniable, but neither spoke of it directly. Both carried too much history of loss to rush toward something that might shatter. Then the dust cloud appeared on the southern horizon. Blue uniforms, white men riding in formation. The familiar shape of her father hunched over his saddle at their head. Maggie's past had finally caught up with her present. The soldiers made camp half a mile from the village, close enough to demonstrate strength. Far enough to avoid immediate conflict. A captain with tired eyes and graying beard rode forward under a white flag. His message was simple and devastating. Return the kidnapped white woman or face the consequences. The United States Army didn't negotiate with savages. They had 24 hours to comply. Maggie watched from beside Ayana as her father dismounted near the soldier camp. Even at distance, she could read the satisfaction in his posture. He'd found her at last, found his excuse for whatever destruction he'd planned. That night, she made her choice. She would return to prevent bloodshed. would sacrifice her newfound home to protect the people who'd given her worth. The decision felt like swallowing ground glass, but some prices had to be paid. Iana found her packing her few possessions in the pre-dawn darkness. He stood in the lodge entrance watching her fold the dress Winona had sewn. His face was stone, but his hands trembled. He told her then what he'd been too careful to say before, that he loved her, not as replacement for his dead wife, but as the woman who'd taught his heart to beat again, who'd shown him that healing didn't require forgetting. The words broke something open in both of them, all the careful distance, all the protective walls. Everything they'd built to keep from hurting again crumbled in the face of absolute honesty. But morning was coming, and with it, a choice that would determine whether love could survive in a world determined to destroy it. Dawn broke pale and merciless over the valley. Maggie stood at the edge of the Comanche village, her small satchel in hand, the same worn leather bag she'd carried the day her father traded her away. But she was not the same woman who'd clutched it in terror and shame. The soldiers waited in formation across the grassland, blue uniforms stark against the green prairie. Silas sat his horse beside Captain Morrison, his face set in lines of righteous indignation. The performance had already begun. Maggie walked forward with Ayana at her side. Standing Bear and his warriors flanked them, two worlds preparing to collide over the body of one woman who belonged fully to neither. Captain Morrison rode out to meet them. His weathered face held the exhaustion of a career soldier who'd seen too much frontier justice. Behind him, Silas urged his horse forward with eager anticipation. The captain's voice carried across the space between armies. Return the kidnapped woman. No negotiation. No delay. The authority of the United States government demanded compliance. Maggie stepped forward before anyone could speak for her. Her voice rang clear in the morning air. She had not been kidnapped. She had been traded by her own father to settle his debts, sold because he found her worthless, abandoned because cruelty came easier than love. Silas's face flushed red with fury. He shouted denials that fooled no one. His daughter was lying, brainwashed by savages, forced to speak against her own blood. But Captain Morrison's eyes had sharpened with interest. His years on the frontier had taught him to recognize truth beneath layers of deception. He asked Maggie to continue. She spoke of the destroyed burial grounds, her father's cattle trampling sacred earth during the drought, the Comanche demand for compensation, Silas's cold calculation in offering his daughter rather than his livestock. The words came steady and sure. No hysteria, no wild accusations, simply the facts laid bare under the morning sun. But she wasn't finished. Maggie pulled a folded paper from her satchel, a surveyor's map she'd found among her father's belongings before leaving the ranch. Mineral deposits marked in red ink across Comanche territory, silver veins that would make a man wealthy beyond imagining. Silas's true motive stood revealed. He didn't want his daughter back. He wanted legal justification to claim Comanche land, a rescued victim to legitimize his theft. Captain Morrison studied the map with growing disgust. His honor as a soldier recoiled from being used in such deception. Behind him, his men shifted uneasily as they realized their role in this fraud. Silas made one last desperate play. He urged his horse forward and reached for Maggie's arm. She was his property, his daughter. No savage had the right to keep what belonged to him. Gianna moved between them with lethal grace. His hand rested on his knife hilt but did not draw. The warning was unmistakable. Maggie faced her father across the space that had always divided them. She spoke the words she should have said years ago. He had never wanted a daughter, only the appearance of respectability. She would not be his excuse for more cruelty. She chose to stay with the Comanche, with people who valued her for who she was rather than what she represented, with a man who loved her completely rather than conditionally. Captain Morrison made his decision with military efficiency. No crime had been committed. No rescue was required. His men would escort Silas Thornfield back to face charges of fraud and filing false reports. The soldiers departed in a cloud of dust and broken dreams. Silas's shouts faded to echoes, then silence. Justice had been served with unusual swiftness on the frontier, but the real victory was quieter, more personal. Gianna turned to Maggie as the dust settled. His dark eyes held everything he'd been too careful to say before. Love without reservation, acceptance without condition, a future built on choice rather than necessity. They married 3 days later, 2 ceremonies to bridge 2 worlds, Comanche ritual under the open sky, Christian vows spoken before Captain Morrison, who'd returned to make their union legal in both jurisdictions. Standing Bear blessed their union with words about 2 peoples learning to live as one. Winona wept with joy as she adjusted Maggie's ceremonial dress. Even Kaya offered grudging congratulations and a beautifully beaded wedding gift. The seasons turned as seasons do. Summer heat gave way to autumn gold, then winter white, then spring's green promise renewed. Maggie's belly swelled with new life. Her Comanche improved until she dreamed in 2 languages. She established a school that served both communities. Comanche children learned to read English. White settlers' children learned respect for the land and its original inhabitants. Understanding grew slowly but surely between peoples who'd known only conflict. Gianna built their lodge near the horse corrals where they'd first learned to trust each other. The sound of running water filled their days. The scent of sage blessed their nights. On quiet evenings, they sat together watching the sun set over land that belonged to no one and everyone. Their hands intertwined, their child quickening between them, their love a bridge spanning the divide between worlds. Maggie thought sometimes of her father's cruelty, how his rejection had led to this unexpected joy, how the worst thing that had ever happened to her had become the best thing that ever could. The cruel father who'd given her away because she was fat had unknowingly given her to a man who loved her with everything he had. Love that saw past surface imperfections to the strength beneath. Love that chose her daily rather than simply accepting her presence. Their first child was born on a morning when snow began to fall. A daughter with her mother's green eyes and her father's steady spirit. They named her Hope in both languages. As Maggie held her baby daughter close, she whispered the promise every parent should make. You are wanted. You are valued. You are loved exactly as you are. The wind carried her words across the prairie toward a future bright with possibility, where love conquered cruelty, where chosen family mattered more than blood, where a woman once deemed worthless had found worth beyond measure. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.